Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. Today I wanted to dedicate an episode on time, and in particular time slips both into the past and future as we move into this new Earth fourth density realm. Our understandings of time begin to change, and we have unique experiences that are very different in our understanding of time. I've discussed simultaneous time in the past on an episode, as well as three-dimensional time on a recent episode regarding Quo, where we discussed time-space and space-time. One of the most fascinating phenomenons that really interests me, as you'll find in this episode, is time slips. I've had this happen many times where I feel I have awakened fully conscious in another aspect of time. Neville Goddard discusses this in many of his lectures, having awoken in another time, being able to freeze time. These are things that are very real and powerful. Many of Neville Goddard's lectures, he talks about freezing time, and the Quo lecture emphasizes that once you move into fourth density, you have access to time, space, and space-time, being able to freeze time and go back through time and analyze it in any manner. So obviously time becomes this essential and important part of our understanding of the shift that we're going through now. And I wanted to discuss this further and document some experiences people have had with time slips both into the past and future. Time, fleeting phantom, ephemeral time, is truly the last frontier in its essential mystery, and an eternal fascination to men and women of all ages. A remorseless stream hurrying them onwards, freezing in the icebergs of the past, their deeds, their triumphs, their follies. It wrenches from their loved ones, it bears them towards the chilly mists of the fearsome future. Prisoners on the ship of life, signed on for the duration of the voyage, we are conscious of the changing scenes, recording in our memories those that have gone, anticipating, predicting, attempting to plan the ship's course, trying to avoid foreseen reefs, steering for comfortable ports. Yet knowing that the inexorable power of the current of time will always bear us on willy-nilly. We have no anchors strong enough to hold us upstream against the current. Time, as the hymn writer Isaac Watts truly said, like an ever-rolling stream bears all its sons away. All living creatures have their biological clocks to measure time's passage. Some crude, like the promptings of hunger. Some precisely attuned to the cycles of nature. Man possesses an additional gift, his mysterious consciousness, his ego, which can contemplate his existence, scan past memories, and extrapolate from them, his ability to map mentally his position in the temporal and spatial environment, the restless curiosity spurring us on to explore our universe. From the time when our intelligence first took us beyond instinctive behavior, we have been fascinated by time and its effects on the world around us. We witnessed the passage of the sun across the sky and the slow yearly oscillation of its sunrise and sunset points against the eastern and western horizons. Linked to these cycles was our experience of the variable heat and brightness of day, the changing seasons, and the migrations of animals. When the sun spent a long time above the horizon, the days were hot, and the growth of living things was strong. When the day's duration was at its shortest, nature was frozen, bitter winds blew, and sleep, death's little brothers, clasped many of the animals in his arms. At night, man saw the moon imitate with impatient speed the sun's risings and settings. We observed the strange sequence of the lunar cycle, and the concept of the month was born. And the coast dweller and the fisherman discovered the even stranger link between the moon's phases and the spring and neap high tides. All the mysterious cycles of the natural world seemed to be governed by the movements of the heavenly bodies, but the stars themselves were immutable, cold, remote diamond chips of light scattered in prodigal profusion at the beginning of time by some creator god across the invisible bowl of night, forever ordained to maintain their patterns while the bowl itself revolved, carrying them from rising to setting. A very few stars, the planets, seemed freer than the rest, wandering at erratic speeds through the fields of space, occasionally stopping as if in contemplation of some cosmic dream, sometimes retracing steps in seemingly purposeful manner for weeks or months on end before resuming their former progress. Change, always change, birth and growth and decay and death. The baby became the little boy, playing with toys, with his pets, with his playmates. The boy disappeared as the youth formed, his personality altered, his former life as baby and boy became memories, faulty and fleeting. The youth became a man, time flew past, bringing with it good harvests and bad, friends and enemies, old age and its infirmities, and always change. The impression forced upon man by nature was one of time passing, of experiences presenting themselves to us in succession, forming out the unpredictable and non-existent future, crystallizing in the real and present now before slipping from our grasp into the fixed past. And as a further ironical trick of time, as we grow older, so does time seem to speed up, so that the endless summers of childhood give way to the ever swifter passage of the seasons in the old age. For when I was a babe and wept and slept, time crept. When I was a boy and laughed and talked, time walked. Then when the years saw me a man, time ran. But as I grow older, time flew. If only I had my time over again, if I only knew what awaited me. I fear the future. Why cannot this moment last forever? If I knew then what I know now. The multitudinous cries of common human beings echo the rueful tributes of poets and playwrights and philosophers to the sovereignty of time passing. In the Bible, in the book of Ecclesiastes, we read, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted." Much later, writing in the 2nd century AD, the philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius Antonius muses, "Time is like a river made up of the events which happen, and its current is strong. No sooner does anything appear than it is swept away, and another comes in its place and will be swept away too." The unstoppable flow of time bringing retribution terrifies the Dr. Faustus of Christopher Marlowe. "Now hast thou but one bare hour to live, and then thou must be damned in perpetuity. Stand still, you ever-moving spheres of heaven, that time may cease and midnight never come." The receding past provokes Shakespeare's Richard to cry, "O call back yesterday, bid time return." We take so much for granted in our lives on this planet that it requires a major shock to awake us from our usual state of unthinking acceptance. One little questioned area of experience is that of time, for we are conditioned from cradle to grave to accept it in a certain form, that of chronology, or of the time of the clock, or linear time. In my book, The Reality Revolution, I discuss the mistake of thinking of time as being linear, that it's more like a pool, that you drop a pebble into that pool and it spreads in all directions, both into the past and the future. This is also discussed by Frederick Dodson in his amazing book, Parallel Universes of Self. Our understanding of time is quite limited. From babyhood, the days, the months, and years are measured out for us. We are taught to tell the time, by which is meant the time recorded by the nearest clock. We learn to interpret the calendar. Which month is May? Which September? And when the seasons begin and end. Yet all this time telling is merely a convenience, a human device originated to enable primitive man and harvest crops. The clock and calendar are mechanisms only to help us order our lives and impose a routine on chaos, but chronology may not be the only form of time. The cosmos itself may produce a temporal mechanism of an entirely different nature. It is likely that the conflict of this cosmic or universal time with man-made chronology is the cause of the extraordinary phenomenon known as time slips, where two aspects or dimensions of time seem to operate at once, and the subject is likely to find himself living in the present and the past, for in some cases the present and the future simultaneously. The experience is at best puzzling and can occasionally be disorienting and alarming. When I was researching for this episode, some extraordinary experiences came to light of time slips that deal with the past. Take, for instance, the case of the Norfolk man who shall be called Mr. Squirrel. The hobby of this elderly man was coin collecting, and like many amateur coin collectors, he used small plastic envelopes as coin receptacles. It was sometime in 1973 that he visited a shop in Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, which he had heard sold suitable envelopes. He knew the whereabouts of the shop, but had never visited it, so when he reached the place, the cobbled space in front of it and the brightly painted facade made an impression on him. He also took in the interior details. There were photograph frames with flower motifs upon them, an old-fashioned till box, and a container full of walking sticks. Before he could examine the place further, the assistant appeared, and Mr. Squirrel noticed that she wore a long black skirt and a blouse he described as having a mutton chop sleeves. The girl's hair was piled on top of her head in a large bun. Since this was 1973, a time of variety in women's dress, with long skirts and period-type costume appearing frequently for day wear, the old gentleman was unperturbed. He asked the young assistant for envelopes for his coins, and she produced these from a brown box full of the objects. When he remarked upon their number, she replied that the men on the sailing ships bought them to use as receptacles for fishhooks. Somewhat surprised, her customer nevertheless took his purchase, paying for them in decimal coinage, introduced in 1971. The shop girl asked for a shilling. This did not surprise the elderly man, who still thought in terms of the old coins. He offered her a 5p piece, at which she looked in astonishment but made no comment. One feature of the transaction had puzzled him. There was total silence inside the shop when he was in it, and no traffic sounds from outside. A week later, he returned for a further supply of envelopes and had the shock of his life when he approached the shop. It appeared to be a totally different place from that of the week before. The cobbles had become pavement. The exterior and interior of the shop were dark and weathered, and the fixtures were not as they had been. Strangest of all, the shop assistant was a mature woman and denied any knowledge of the young girl he had seen the previous week. Worse was to come, for she met with a blank negative his request for further envelopes. Their shop had never stocked them, she said. The shop's manager supported her in this statement. The only evidence the old man had he had ever bought anything was the few small envelopes purchased the previous week. The old-fashioned street and the shop with its Edwardian assistant and merchandise had disappeared as though they had never been. The possible date of the envelopes was later checked with the manufacturer, who said that bags of such a type were first used in the 1920s, though the method of manufacture was perfected before the First World War. This was a particularly strange, inconclusive case of slipping time, of the apparent impingement of time past upon the present. A striking instance of a past slip occurred to Mrs. Terrell Clark, a one-time resident of Wisley-cum-Purford in Surrey, where her experience took place. The lady was cycling down the modern road on her way to evensong in her village church, when abruptly the road appeared to become a field path, and she seemed to be walking along it. Coming towards her, she saw a man in the pleasant dress of the 13th century, and he stood to one side to allow her to pass. She felt herself at the time to be wearing a nun's robes. A month later, this lady sat in the same parish church. It had formerly been a small chapel attached to a nearby Newark Abbey and had miraculously survived the dissolution of the monasteries. Joining with the choir in singing a plain-song hymn, halfway through the chant, she saw, to her astonishment, the church changed to its original state. Earth floor, stone altar, lancet windows, and processing around the center space were brown-habited monks intoning the same plain-song chant that occupied the 20th century choir. Yet at this moment of apprehension, Mrs. Terrell Clark also knew herself to be one of a small group of people at the back of the church taking little part in the proceedings. On inquiry, this lady found that the monks of the Newark Abbey wore black habits and could not be figures of her experience. However, in the year 1293, the monks of Westminster Abbey had apparently been granted the use of the chapel, and they were indeed a brown-habited order. Another startling experience was reported by Miss Louisa Hand. It concerned the hamlet of Cockymore near Bury, Lancashire, and visits that this lady paid in childhood to her grandmother's cottage, which was the first of a row in the hamlet. Louisa was at the time aged about 9 and old enough not to mistake one dwelling for another. Then there is the story of the curious cottage. The child had been playing in front of the houses when she decided to go in and ran back through the open door of her grandmother's cottage only to find herself in a strange environment. The furniture was different and older. The kitchen doorway had disappeared entirely, and everything seemed darker than usual and unnaturally quiet. Thinking she had mistaken the house, the girl ran out to check. This time she made certain the right door before re-entering, yet again found herself in the same strange surroundings as before. She went out immediately, puzzled and uneasy. After several minutes, she again entered the same cottage and this time found everything as she remembered it. One of her aunts was at work in the kitchen. Normality had returned. There seems little doubt the child had walked into the cottage's past, but how? This story, explained in the book Mysteries of Mind and Space and Time, The Unexplained, gives a real example that is given in many other stories. But what mechanism was involved? She seemed to cross a threshold, remarking as she did the quality of silence, just as did Mr. Squirrel. Louisa also noticed the darker aspect of the room, but this is accountable. The amount of light admitted to houses has increased as windows have become larger. The dislocation seems to have been abrupt, as was the transition back into the present. On the 29th May 1973, a Norwich teacher, Miss Anne May, according to the same book, and her husband visited Clava Cairns in Inverness, a group of 3 burial cairns dating from the early Bronze Age, 1800 to 1500 BC. The day was crisp, bright, and lively with birdsong, and Miss May first walked around the cairns, then turned to the circles of monoliths surrounding each. Finally, she leaned against a stone belonging to the northeastern cairn and briefly closed her eyes in an attempt at the yogi's slipped second, a moment of complete blankness. When she opened then, she saw a group of men wearing shaggy tunics, and she thought cross-gartered trousers. They were moving forward slowly, apparently dragging one of the huge monoliths over the ground. She particularly noticed the figure's long dark hair. This curious vision might have persisted had not a party of tourists entered the glade. At once she was back in the 20th century. This is a particularly clear example of what appears to happen in time slips. Subject was interested in her surroundings but not concentrating upon them. The slip occurred at a precise place and moment when her body touched the monolith, and the transition from present to past was immediate, as was its reversal. The author of the book Mysteries of Mind and Space-Time also had a similar experience when visiting Haddon Hall in Derbyshire. During research for that book, she was not concerned with work, for this was a holiday visit to a house she had always hoped to see. She had paused in the courtyard before the house, considering its architecture, the entrance door, and the flight of steps up to it, when without warning she saw a group of 4 children playing at the top of the steps. A small child, 2 older boys, and a still older girl of about 9. The latter had her back to her, and she could see only shoulder-length blonde hair, a white Dutch hat, and a long green-gray silk dress with a lace collar. The children were laughing helplessly at some huge joke, and the author watched fascinated, fully aware she was not seeing with the physical eye, yet equally conscious of watching real action. Then the elder girl turned to face her. She had expected a little beauty and saw instead extreme plainness, broad face, snub nose, wide jaw. Startled, she took a step forward, and at once the scene vanished. The author toured the house looking for a portrait, for she was sure that the eldest child at least belonged to Hayden. Among the ancestral paintings that hung on the paneled walls was one of a blonde child wearing a Dutch hat and a gray silk dress with a lace collar. The baby's face was that of a girl she had seen outside, the wide jawline unmistakable. She was, said the custodian when asked, Lady Grace Manners. Again, there is a trigger factor. As in Anne May's case, she leaned against a certain stone. The author stood upon a certain spot, and when she moved from it, the picture vanished. Some past slips appeared to relate to possible reincarnation experiences, others to what was once considered a type of haunting. All seem to be natural in their operation, in that they apparently have some connection with the human electromagnetic field. So time is not at all a matter of clocks and watches. Indeed, they have little to do with the real time of the universe. There are many views of time, and the alternate views of time include those of J.W. Dunn, whose pioneering work in the field was first expressed in an experiment with time, which I first learned in Frederick Dotson's book on time travel. Dunn's attitude was revolutionary for the 20s, stating, as it did, that chronology was not the only form that can take place in time. Most of his theories were based on the evidence of his dreams, which were frequently precognitive and often related to subsequent events as reported in newspapers. By keeping a record of his dreams, Dunn came to realize they were a blend of past, present, and future. Although he realized he had made a major discovery, he made the mistake of thinking his experience unique, and although he grasped the concept of precognition, he failed to understand it and pursued the idea of time as a dimension that led ultimately into a dead end. It was Dunn's work, however, that inspired the second great time inquirer of the 20th century, the writer J.B. Priestley. He saw time as a divided process in three segments. Time 1, clock time. Time 2, the time of the possible future. And time 3, the time of the creative imagination. His book, Man and Time, written in the 1940s, contains fascinating insights into the possible nature of time. He claimed that the chronological time is only an invention to explain the way events follow one another. That is, it is a concept that is dependent on the idea of causality, and if, as C.G. Jung suggested, acausality is one of the ruling principles of the universe, there is no reason why time should not play all the tricks it pleases. Researchers into the curious phenomenon known as time slips frequently begin their study with the assumption that the majority of cases would refer to time past, that is, where the present suddenly gives way to a different time dimension and the past is experienced. But even a cursory glance at the vast file of reported cases would prove such researchers wrong. We have amazing stories that have been written in fiction, from Stephen King to the Outlander series, all talking about different versions of time slips. Future time slips seem almost as common as those belonging to the past, though, although frequently they appear to cause those who experience them more alarm, perhaps because they cannot be explained away as prior knowledge. Precognitive experiences appear to fall into one of two categories: waking premonition or precognition, and precognitive dreams. The latter in turn may include recurrent dreams forecasting the future, but single dreams are more common. The subject matter may be of a trivial or a tragic nature. Curiously, perhaps the dramatic events in life seem to have no priority in the mechanism, but occur in about the same proportion as those dealing with trivia. Take the case of Cheshire teacher who shall be called Mrs. Zena Stafford in June 1942. She dreamed that she was packing a trunk with clothes that she removed from a nearby wardrobe. Taking clothes I did not possess from a wardrobe, I had never seen to put into a trunk I didn't own. As she described it, she was to become a student at Manchester University the following autumn, but at the time of the dream had not even begun to think of what she would need by way of clothes and did not possess a trunk of any sort. In the September following her dream, an uncle bought her a trunk from a lost property sale in London. Her mother made and bought her a selection of new clothes, and eventually she moved into a hall of residence for female students. She found that her new roommate had commandeered the best bed and wardrobe, and she, Zena, was left with an old triangular wardrobe which she did not at the time recognize. It was not until the end of the first term, where she found herself packing her trunk beside her wardrobe, that she recalled the dream of 6 months earlier and recognized the details as identical, a small-scale but significant experience. Another dream giving trivial precognitive information occurred to Mrs. M. Bussell, who at the time was working in Gray's Inn Road, London, and regularly used the underground from her home in Stockwell to Chancery Lane. In the early hours one morning, she dreamed that she was ascending the steps of Chancery Lane Underground Station, as she usually did, and that she climbed the steps on the right-hand side. She happened to glance across to the flight on the left. Coming down, then she saw a middle-aged woman with a crippled leg, which caused her to descend with great slowness and caution. Mrs. Bussell awoke at this point, and she felt somewhat irritated by the apparent pointlessness of the dream. Had she varied her route to work that morning, the memory might have gone from her mind. However, she went as usual via Chancery Lane Tube Station, and she climbed the right-hand steps. She chanced to glance to her left. Descending the left-hand flight was the very woman of the morning's dream, walking down with extreme care on account of a crippled leg. The subject would make no sense of the incident. She had never seen the woman before, nor did she again. The dream had merely announced an event some hours ahead of its taking place. No sequel occurred, no meaning attached to it. It was a piece of simple precognition only. It is not uncommon for dreams to feature specific places that are at the time unknown to the dreamer. The scene may then be encountered later, and the dream thereupon regarded as precognitive. However, this need not be the case. The mind appears often to register information subconsciously through pictures seen in waking life and afterwards forgotten save for a dream. Then, when the actual place is encountered in real life, it is believed to have been announced precognitively by the dream. Occasionally, such place recognition is encountered in the form of a recurrent dream. One man described a Tudor-style country mansion built as a square set in a fine garden with grassy banks. The dream recurred every year, but it was not until he stayed in Leamington Spa in Warwickshire that he visited the beautiful house of Compton Winyates and recognized it at once as the subject of his dream. It should be noted again that nothing of importance occurred to this dreamer in connection with the house, and why it should have stalked his dreams for some 20 years is incomprehensible. However, perhaps one of the mistakes we make is in thinking that all apparently paranormal events are bound to have significance. The truth seems to be otherwise. Some strange happenings have significance that is recognizable sooner or later, others do not. They occur impartially. The incidence of precognitive dreams is exceeded by waking precognition. This is extremely common, is almost always involuntary, and frequently only a short time ahead of the event it heralds. It seems to be predictive rather than premonitory, concerning minor rather than major events. However, when dramatic events are predicted, they are usually precise and unmistakable. It is also more common for the development time, that is, the time between the precognitive experience and its fulfillment, to be short-term, a matter of hours or days rather than weeks or months. Yet, cases do exist where the precognition has been exceedingly long-term. One of the most striking instances of precognition of a dramatic event occurred to Miss R.H. Hodgkins of Birmingham and her friend, who shall be called Tess G. On the 20th of April 1974, the two were spending some time in London and decided to visit the tower, which is perhaps of all London's monuments, the most emotive with its mixed history of royalty, pageantry, pain, and terror. However, on the day of the two friends' visit, all was peaceful in the White Tower. Their immediate goal housed only the armory and a number of tourists like themselves. Having spent some time inspecting the weapons of the pair, began to find the atmosphere of the dungeons oppressive and decided to return to the open air. They were halfway up the steps when Tessa turned to her friend and said, "I can hear children shouting." Miss Hodgkins could hear nothing but a faint murmur of conversation from below, and said so. Tessa became agitated and her voice rose. "No," she said, "I can hear children shouting and screaming." Her friend could still hear nothing unusual, and each was inclined to doubt the evidence of the other's senses. However, Tessa G. was obviously convinced that she heard the children's cries and was deeply disturbed by them. Eventually, the deadlock was resolved by a return to the light in search of a restorative cup of tea. The affair was then put out of their minds for the time being. It was a few months later that a terrorist bomb planted in the armory of the White Tower exploded, killing and seriously injuring a number of people, including several children. What was it that Tessa G. heard? A sound of pain and terror from the tower's dismal past, or the agony of children who would suffer in that place some months ahead of her experience? In the circumstances, the latter view seems most likely, although there is no means of proving or disproving the matter without having heard both the hallucinatory and the actual sounds. It is apparent that in precognitive as in retrocognitive occurrences, the experience may be either heard or seen, with occasional combinations of the two. Two television series based on the concept of time slips were produced by the BBC Eastern Region, and these in turn gave rise to a flood of letters from viewers with time experiences of their own to report. One particularly interesting case came from a teacher in Holt, Norfolk. While involved in a slight traffic accident in that town, he happened to notice that a nearby laundrette that had been under construction for some time was now completed and in use by the public. He reported the fact to his wife on his return home, but when she took laundry there later in the day, she was puzzled to find that she had made the journey in vain. The laundrette, though seen in its completed and bustling state by her husband some hours later, was actually still unfinished, full of dust and workmen, and it had been for several months. It was 6 weeks after this incident that the place was actually opened to the public for use. Therefore, the Norfolk teacher had seen the completed shop several weeks ahead of his own moment in time. Such experiences are, to say the least, disorienting and leave the subject doubting the workings of his own brain. However, it may well be that it is the brain itself that is acting as transformer and interpreter of information coming from the future. Precognitive information does not always have meaning for the person who experiences it. Occasionally, it relates only obliquely to the subject. Take, for instance, the case of a cousin of Mrs. E.H. of Bourne End. Before 1939, this cousin knew slightly a young man who was the boyfriend of one of her girlfriends. At the outbreak of war, he joined the RAF and was soon on active service. Several months later, the cousin had what she thought was a waking dream in which she saw clear mental images but knew herself not to be asleep. These images were of a little raft on which the young man in question was lying, apparently near death. She heard him ask distinctly that she tell his sister of what had happened, that he had been shot down and drifting on the life raft for 2 days. A few days later, she ran into this very young man who was on leave in London and was relieved to see him perfectly well and normal. He had apparently had no adverse experiences at this stage. The young woman dismissed the matter as just a silly dream. More than 2 years passed before she read in the paper of his death. He had been found dead on a life raft and had apparently been there for some considerable time. On inquiry, she discovered that he had indeed had a sister, but the latter had recently died. The cousin's message, therefore, could not be delivered. This is a curious case, both on account of the long time lag between vision and event, and because of the very slight connection between the subject and the apparent transmitter. The airman of the information of Miss E.H.'s cousin seemingly picked up the details of this distant event, apparently at the will of the airman himself, and the information seems to have been intended for transmission. A fascinating example of this type of long-range foretelling. The incidence of precognition is widespread. Prediction has a history almost as long as that of the human race, and prophets have always had some honor, though alas not always in their own country. Indeed, when prophecies have been gloomy and accurate, seeing the future has often proved downright dangerous. However, precognition still occurs and does not appear to be subject to human control. Perhaps one day we could learn to control it. To most people, time slips, if they think about them at all, are firmly relegated to the realm of the supernatural and left at that. But the supernatural cannot exist, since any event arising in the natural universe in which we live must have natural origins. If we cannot explain any phenomenon in terms of the known laws of nature, then this must be because our current knowledge of those laws is incomplete. Who could explain the mechanism of an eclipse before the true motions of the planets were known? But the mechanism of time slips eludes us still. We can only sift the evidence and search for some common denominators among the experiences and possible some relationships with known laws of physics. So far, these common factors have been discovered. 1. A trigger factor that appears to set the occurrence in motion. 2. Abrupt onset of the experience. And 3. A sensation of living in two time zones at once, either past and present or future and present. 4. A feeling of being an integral part of the experience or a participant in the action. 5. A noticeable absence of sound from the beginning to end of the time slip. And 6. A marked difference is frequently mentioned between normal light conditions and those experienced during the time slip. A silvery light is often described. From what I've just mentioned, it seems that certain physical effects take place. The subject sees and hears abnormally and experiences a feeling of disorientation or detachment. Occasionally, people have reported a tingling sensation or nausea immediately before they experience a time slip, just as particularly sensitive people may react to an impending earthquake or thunderstorm. It is interesting that several of the sensations described can also herald hauntings or other paranormal happenings. One subject wrote describing a tingling in arms and legs, a feeling of being plugged in. She may have been very near the truth, for there are indications that some form of electrical activity plays a part in many paranormal experiences. A plugging in or trigger was a major factor in the case of Miss Anne May, the Norwich teacher who in May 1973 at Clough-Cairns in Scotland experienced a slip into what appears to be the remote past of the area. Significantly, it was not until she leaned back against one of the standing stones that the extraordinary transition into the past took place, as though a switch had been thrown. Several have used that very phrase in describing their individual time slips, and the immediacy of the slip is always pronounced. It is as though the trigger object, in Anne May's case, the stone itself, contained the power to evoke the time dislocation. This may not be so far-fetched as it sounds, for if the operation of time slips is due to the transmitting of information from past or future into the present, then the information must already be in existence somewhere. Perhaps every single component of the world in which we live is continually broadcasting information about itself. Its form, color, texture, situation, and so on, by means of waves as yet unknown to science. Some of this information may be received and absorbed by surrounding material, and when conditions are appropriate, rebroadcast by the receiver. Check out my episode on psychometrics. Many people have the unique ability to hold an object and go into the past of that object, and this may be happening through these waves. Any human being then in the area whose own brain is at the time operating at the same frequency as the transmitter may register an audio or visual impression of the original wave pattern sent forth by the first broadcaster. Thus, we ourselves in moments of high emotions or stress may be sending out signals into the air that will be received years hence by some sensitive individual. Most though perhaps not all, hauntings can probably be attributed to this sort of wave mechanism. What are these mysterious waves that have the power to carry pictures and sounds through time? We do not know, but it is a physical fact that all objects radiate electromagnetic waves. Light waves, which enable us to perceive the world around us, are just one example. Radio waves, infrared and ultraviolet waves, X-rays and gamma rays are all electromagnetic. Most of these invisible radiations were discovered within the last century. Who can say what further kinds of radiation await discovery? The fascinating branch of physics called quantum mechanics posits the concept of electrons in atoms, and our universe is constructed on the atom, moving backwards and forwards in time equally easily. Perhaps, therefore, it is possible for information from the future to be returned to the present by some as yet totally unknown mechanism. This wave or particle is described in Star Trek as the tachyon, and unfortunately some have embraced and spoken of the subject of tachyons as if it is a scientifically proven truth, when in fact the tachyon is still hypothetical. The tachyonic particle was first theorized in 1967 by Gerald Feinberg. He proposed that tachyonic particles could be made of excitations of the quantum field with imaginary mass. I have had people that have messaged me saying, "Oh, I know the secrets of tachyons." I know as a fact we have not discovered tachyons as of yet, but theoretically, they absolutely could be true. But if information can be returned from the future, then that future must already exist somewhere in some form. And it may be that we ourselves, and indeed all atomic material, carry within us the seeds of our own future. The behavior of individual atomic particles is unpredictable, but it is possible to predict how they will behave en masse, in groups. In other words, by cause and effect, all events seem to be predetermined. Perhaps the idea of destiny arose from an instinctive knowledge of this very fact, that we are what we are and do what we do because we are constructed genetically in a certain way. If this were always and wholly true, we and the whole of human history would indeed be predestined, and our futures would be laid down for us inescapably. However, it appears that we do have the power to alter and modify our destiny, at least occasionally, by the exercising of our will. And I believe that precognitive information is coming from one possible future and one possible timeline. So definitely check out Reality Transurfing, where we discuss the concept of timelines. There's also the possibility bubbling in my mind that this is the result of quantum jumps. You may quantum jump into another reality that is existing in this present time, but that reality may be backwards in time, meaning that it's still 2021 or 2022, whenever you're listening to this, but at the time that you quantum jump, it's 2021 or 2022, but it's still the time and the place that you're at is different. They don't have automobiles, or they don't have the things that we have now, and it appears that you're going back in time, but you've quantum jumped into a reality that is older. That's always a possibility that, in my mind, may be true. When we encounter precognitive experiences, whether dreaming or waking, it may be that we're receiving from matter already existing, people, animals, or buildings, information about its own future development. In the short term, such information is likely to prove true. In the long term, I would say less so. For over a longer period of time, there is a greater likelihood of human will being used to intervene in the cause and effect, the causality process. With more time available, there are more opportunities for action, and therefore more opportunity for change and more timelines. However, there are exceptions. Occasionally, precognitive experiences will come to completion accurately several years after they have been encountered. There are 2 known cases where there was a full 20-year lapse between the experience and its accurate fulfillment. This is, however, unusual. Past slips cannot always be explained as recordings of past events, though doubtless this mechanism accounts for a great number. Several persons have reported finding themselves actively involved in some historical occasion. One woman, Mrs. D. Dove, while walking near Bootham Bar, York, suddenly found herself in the past when a shaft of sunlight struck a coat of arms on the medieval city gate. At once her awareness of the present dissolved, and she discovered herself standing in the midst of a medieval scene, milling, barrows, carts, and a great crowd of people. She saw mounted horsemen clearing the way for some great personage who followed them. Then the sun went in and the whole glowing picture disappeared. There seems little doubt that Mrs. Dove saw an actual historical scene and was herself briefly a part of it, such as Mrs. Turrell Clark that we mentioned earlier. Here again, the trigger factor is present, in this case, the sudden shaft of light on the coat of arms of the city gate. Is it possible that the bar itself had recorded this scene from its own past, and that particular conditions of light provided the sudden flash of sunshine switched on the playback? If that were so, why did the bar choose to replay this scene out of all its millions of recorded moments? And why was the scene not witnessed and reported by everyone else present in the modern precincts of Bootham Bar in the 20th century York? This may be because it's individualized to the person that's experiencing that, perhaps because of a reincarnative experience. The human brain operates electrically and uses several frequencies. There is some variation from brain to brain, and not all operate on exactly the same frequencies. It is possible that persons sensitive to psychic phenomenon are merely tuning in to existing wave patterns, either past or future, by accident, their own brain activity being on the correct frequency for reception at the time. Tom Lethbridge, the master dowser, reached much the same conclusion. It is also true that many bizarre time experiences can be explained as hallucinations. The brain's memory processes are incompletely understood, and the subconscious mind has proved to be very complex. Dreams and hypnosis reveal a level of creativity inaccessible to the conscious mind, and the full scope of genetic inheritance is not yet known. It may not be reincarnation, but memory that's coming from our genetics that is producing these memories. The brain's memory processes are completely misunderstood, and the subconscious mind is very complex. Time dislocations may sometimes be the result of these or imaginative responses, or hysteria, drug usage, or illness. However, when all these factors have been considered and eliminated, there remains a great number of experiences that cannot be accounted for, or can only be accounted for by analogies that relate to the electromagnetic force field every human possesses, and through which he doubtless gives and receives information. If electrical data fed into the brain from outside sources is capable of being translated by the brain into terms of pictures and sound, then many so-called psychic phenomena, including time slips, may be explained. I can certainly talk about this forever, but I am inspired by the fact when you read the Law of One material, when they're channeling Ra and they ask Ra questions, hey, why did our tape break when we were recording that session? Ra can simply go back and explain exactly what happened. And there is this reality in the future where at any point in time, you'll be able to freeze time and go back and examine all the causes and effects for whatever happens. And you may have already experienced this and be aware of it, and this may be an ability that you have that is just simply never used in third density, and you may suddenly walk into some place in time and space, and you're just accessing this field of time that exists behind us. I really, really want to hear your stories. Please share your stories of time slips that you might have experienced, and I think you'll be really surprised. It sounds like I'm talking about something unusual or supernatural, a mystery, but if you share your experiences, I have a feeling that everybody has experienced time slips, and they happen all the time. When I look at an object, when I look at a house, when I look at a field, I can see all the different history behind it all the time. And I'm fascinated by this. It's happened enough to me where I'm wondering, is this my imagination? And that's why I'm presenting this episode to you. And I would love to hear your story. So please put them in the comments. In any case, you can find all episodes of The Reality Revolution at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to The Reality Revolution.